So we do the Title IX, behavior intervention, crisis response, the risk management stuff. So we're the consulting group that works with you all on all those things. So happy to be here. Yeah, happy to work with you. It's been a good relationship over time.
I call him once a month at least, it seems like. So I thought it was
Well, this will be a good group to talk to.
responsibilities that we have to do, but I do believe that Clery is something that is really important. We have a lot of new faces in the room, and wanting just to make sure that everybody understood the importance of Clery and how we take it very seriously on our campus, and that needs to be portrayed from the top down on our campus, and that's why I have brought in two very experts on the field. Some of you may know them, but I do want to introduce them to you before we get started. The reason that the camera is in here, we are live streaming at the OU HSC campus in Oklahoma City, the OU HSC campus in Tulsa, and also in Arezzo, Italy. So we are able to give this to those who could not be here on our campus right now. They are not able to join us in audio, but they can hear everything that's being said. As the emergency manager at the university, and some of you may not know that that is my title. My name is Lisa Teal. I am the emergency manager for OU Norman campus. I am also the Clery compliance officer for the university. That means that I make sure that everything that is supposed to be in our AFSR, we call that the Sooner Safety Report, and you have all read that. Cover to cover, I know, because that's very important to me. It's one of my babies, and I work on it all year long. But that is one of the things that I have to do, is to make sure that everything that the law says, the Clery Act says, that has to be in our AFSR is in there, and what is in there is correct, and that's the policy that we're doing. So I have a committee that I work with throughout the year, and then we work on this, and we've made some great strides here at OU for what we've done with our Clery compliance and our Sooner Safety Report, but we do have a long way to go in that direction. As the emergency manager, I do have to give you the emergency for the room. That's something that's very important to me, and I'd also like to see that being through all of our presentations that we do. I do know we are not expecting tornadoes, so we don't have to worry about where you would go in this building for severe weather today. However, if there were the fire, if the alarms went off, I would gather up all of the sign-in sheets. We would proceed down the stairs, go out the doors, and I am sorry. I guess I should be the one to say something to cell phones. Go out the doors. Because it is cold, we would not go to the primary location, which is at the corner of Felger and Asp. That's our emergency assembly area. Because it is a chilly day, we have alternate assembly area for this building, and we would go to the library. So you would not have to stand outside for 30 to 45 minutes while the fire department showed up, cleared the building, and make sure it was okay for you all to come back in. If we did have anything to where we had an armed intruder or anything like that, we would shelter in place in this building, and we are very fortunate we have Chief Woolen with us here today. So at least we might get a heads up that we would shelter in place in the room. So if you have any, and I know most of you are all from here, national and international conferences. He has trained thousands of faculty and staff members on how to prevent, address, and properly report incidents on campus, such deals with Title IX or Clery crimes. He also is a law enforcement trainer on how to investigate sensitive matters such as abuse and assault. He presents regularly at schools and campuses throughout the country. He assists colleges and universities with legal, judicial, and risk management issues, as well as policy development and implementation. He serves as an author and an editor in a number of areas, including legal issues in higher education, campus safety and student development, campus conduct boards, training, and other education issues. And he assists clients overseas and conducts investigations and hearings for student, staff, faculty misconduct. He has also investigated thousands of allegations of misconduct. He is partnered here with Dr. John Wesley Lowry, excuse me.
That was John. You're a Methodist.
Methodist. Dr. John Wesley. He joined the NCHERN group as an affiliated consultant in August of 2009. He's a full professor in Student Affairs and Higher Education Department at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. We won't hold this one against him, but he previously served on the faculty at Oklahoma State University. I told you, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was the response I expected.
Where he coordinated the college student affairs and higher education programs. His first faculty appointment was at the University of South Carolina. He has a master's degree in student personnel services from the University of South Carolina, and his undergraduate degree in religious studies is from the University of Virginia. He earned his doctorate at Bowling Green State University in higher education administration. Throughout his career, John has served on several boards of directors and previously chaired the ASJA's Legislative Issues and Resolutions Committees, as well as co-chairing the Inter-Association Task Force on the National Baseline Study on Campus Sexual Assault. Before beginning his doctoral work in 1996, he was Director of Residence Life at Adrian College in Michigan and University Judicial Administrator at Washington University in St. Louis. Please welcome Dr. John, and I will turn it over to you, gentlemen.
Thanks. And good morning. So I just realized since you and I first spoke, there's actually a correction to the bio that I need to make. It is an important correction. I was serving in an acting capacity as the Chief Officer for Response and Resolution for the United States Center for Safe Sport. It was a 6-month appointment to help reestablish the needs of that organization from a budgetary and structural perspective, and that role has ended. I might say mercifully. It was quite the task. So for those of you who don't know, try to get this promo out there to the world. So the United States Center for Safe Sport was created in April of 2017 as a matter of law, and is the sole independent agency that is responsible for prevention, investigation, and adjudication of all allegations of sexual misconduct and emotional and physical abuse in any of the Olympic movement sports, from the club level, tiny kids in gymnastic studios, all the way up to the Olympians. And so they have this will make us all feel better about our jobs in dealing with abuse and harassment and the things we deal with. Their constituency is about 18 million. And so to give you an idea of the scope of the work in preventing sexual misconduct and sexual assault, which we're going to talk about today, sort of intersection of our world, Title IX, their world, just sexual abuse and assault. Obviously, we don't deal with minors as much, but the center's currently receiving about 50 reports a week, of which they will assume jurisdiction, which is far exceeding the scope that we believed it would be when we opened the doors a year and a half or so ago. And so it will eventually plateau, it will eventually drop, hopefully as close to zero as we can get it. But it's, as I put it to some folks in Washington a few months ago, when we were asking them for money to staff the center with appropriate investigators, because we had 6. I'd be like, this was as if you had the city of New York and you had 6 sexual assault investigators for the entire city. And they were like, oh. And I was like, just wanted to give you some scope, so we can all wrap our heads around some parallel there. Whenever I talk about that, and I know Bobby's in the room, it always makes the Title IX officers go, yeah, we don't get 50 in a week. Like, see, I feel better already.
It doesn't help when you recruit my staff.
Yeah. That raid happened after I left, Bobby. I'm going to point that out. You can blame Mike Henry for that. I always like to get that out because I know many of us have relatives and friends and children that play in these sports, and there's great education out there. And actually, colleges and universities are going to benefit from this, because this next year is going to be committed at the center to creating prevention education for coaches and parents of athletes, of older athletes. They've already got some really good stuff for young kids, but that's going to benefit us in education because that's free workshops that'll have easy application to our faculty as well on how to recognize symptoms and how to prevent things. So a lot of proactive stuff that I was talking about with the group yesterday. So I'm going to hand this over to John, and we're going to start our conversation about CSAs.
Yeah, we wanted to start by talking about Clery and talking about Clery really from a big picture perspective. And one of the things we'll talk about certainly are the issues of CSAs. It's important to understand, I think, or at least valuable, to understand a couple of things before we start. We'll talk some later on about Title IX, and there is a sense, accurately so, right now that there is a great deal of uncertainty and sort of a whiplash effect in terms of expectations as they relate to Title IX. The reality is that's not the case with Clery. There is bipartisan agreement that campus crime is a serious problem that institutions need to address, and there is no meaningful difference in the enforcement of the Clery Act from one administration to another. So I think that's important to recognize that for all of the uncertainty as it surrounds Title IX, in terms of enforcement, that's not the case with the Clery Act. We're not in a moment where it's who knows what's going to happen next. The law, as many do, has its origins in a tragedy. A young woman by the name of Jean Clery, who was a student at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, who was raped and murdered by a fellow student who made his way to her room because at that time, in the mid-'80s, it was not uncommon that students would, for their convenience and the convenience of others, prop open doors with pizza boxes and duct tape. And since we were both students at that time, I can remember all the things that we did, and we didn't even think about it. And her parents believed that Lehigh University was engaged in an active effort to hide the realities of campus crime. And their position perhaps softened somewhat about that over the years, but they also recognized that there was no law at the time that required colleges and universities to share information about campus crime so that students could make informed decisions for themselves. There's a problem with that assumption. 18 to 20-year-olds in particular aren't good at that sort of rational decision making. But it led them to seek legislation. They sought legislation first in Pennsylvania in the late 80s, and then in 1990, the Clery Act was passed for the first time. And pretty much every time since then that Congress has had the opportunity, they have amended the law. So each time since 1990 that Congress has reauthorized the Higher Education Act, they have modified in varying levels of significance the Clery Act, and they have modified it at other times as well. They modified it most recently with the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, but there had been earlier examples of changes outside of the context of the Higher Education Act. For example, when they put the sex offender registry requirements into the Clery Act. We have another round. Depending on who you listen to, we may see the Higher Education Act reauthorized this year. Lamar Alexander really wants to do that, but he really wanted to do that last year and the year before that. Since the law was last reauthorized in 2008 and it's on a 5-year reauthorization cycle, they're a little off. And we don't know yet whether or not there will be significant changes pursued. It's too early to tell. Perhaps you had to pick one new area that they would address that they have not addressed in Clery to date, it's likely to be hazing. If you had to pick one issue that they might choose to address. And one of the mistakes, and I think it was a mistake in 1990, and it has become increasingly so, is to think about the Clery Act solely as a responsibility of campus law enforcement. They certainly have a large role to play. But to think of it solely as their responsibility, I think, is a fundamental error for a number of reasons. One, when the Department of Education comes calling, the person that they're going to call is President Gallagher. That's who they see as responsible. And Furthermore, when you look at the various compliance efforts and the various compliance obligations, there are a number of them that rest completely outside of campus law enforcement. And I think early on, one of the mistakes that institutions made was to see this solely as a campus law enforcement responsibility. And one of the things that we have seen, and I think particularly in the past decade, there's been a greater appreciation of the need for this to be a cross-disciplinary team that addresses these issues. Particularly since 2008, I think the last significant revision. And there are a couple of reasons why it doesn't stay limited to campus law enforcement. When you think about the Clery Act, people naturally have a tendency to immediately think of your annual security and fire safety report. And that is an important dimension of the Clery Act. And there are a host of policies in here that are not the responsibility of campus law enforcement. There are others on campus, whether it's information that has to be shared about educational programming that's happening across the campus, information that has to be shared about your student conduct and your other processes for addressing sexual assault. And also there are the statistics. And the statistics that have to be reported, there are a variety of sources that those are based on. Obviously, campus law enforcement is one of those. And this is where we get into the conversation that Scott suggested that we would get to quickly, and that's the idea of campus security authorities. Because the Department of Education requires that statistics be provided that are reported to one of two groups, campus security authorities or local police. And campus security authorities is a very broad group. It does obviously include, and no one is ever surprised when you say that campus police and security departments are campus security authorities. That doesn't shock anyone. However, it's when you move further into this list. Other sort of bulleted groups are individuals who have responsibility for security, which on its surface seems straightforward. But two of the groups that the Department of Education has specifically identified there are individuals who monitor access to student facilities, which could well mean students who are swiping IDs to get into the rec center or into the residence halls. And it's one of the places that the Department of Education hangs its hat. It's not the only one. But one of the places where they hang their hat for requiring that resident assistants be campus security authorities, arguing that they have a role in that regard. Now, there's one of the ways someone can become a campus security authority is by the university telling the community that they are a campus security authority. That makes them one, if they aren't already. But then lastly, there is this, and this is where it gets interesting, officials with significant responsibility for student and campus activities. Now, to be fair, the Department of Education defines all of those words differently than we do. Significant student and campus activities mean something different to them. And let me give you some examples. Some you won't be surprised by when they talk about examples of individuals who have significant responsibility for student and campus activities. Nobody is surprised that the Dean of Students and the Director of Residence Life and the Director of Student Activities have significant responsibility for student and campus activities. But also, listed by name as examples, directors of athletics, all coaches, including part-time employees and graduate assistants, significant responsibility for student and campus activities. Faculty advisors to student organizations. One of the areas where the Department of Education has really stretched this, and I'll be the first to admit that lots of people disagree with them on this interpretation, they've even said when the university requires organizations to have advisors who are not university employees, that those people are campus security authorities. Where that comes up most often, fraternities and sororities. And that's an issue that the fraternity and sorority national groups are very concerned about, and I'll be honest, I'm concerned about that as well. But for me, because of realistically, what's our ability to get compliance out of those folks? And it's a hard enough job to educate everyone who meets the already broadened definition of CSAs. It gets a lot more complex when they're not employees of the institution.
Well, and that's a twofold problem, John. One is the issue of our only hammer to their failure to comply would be to say, well, then you can't be the advisor to this organization. And then we're tackled with, if I have to comply with that and I'm not employed by the institution, am I accepting some liability by being the alumni advisor to this group? And if I'm going to do that, do I want to take that on? And then they can't have one, and then they're not compliant. And then we're dealing with the fraternity saying, how are we going to comply with this rule that you've imposed on us that we can't comply with, but you want us to be on your campus because we have a strong alumni presence, we do all this stuff, it's a long history and tradition of the institution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a troubling one. It seems to take outside of our jurisdiction, really.
One of the ones that they've been clearer about in recent years, and it represents an overlap between the topics that we're going to primarily be talking about, is Title IX coordinators. And they've acknowledged at least the potential exists that a deputy Title IX coordinator who does nothing with student complaints, so that if you had a deputy Title IX coordinator who solely dealt with employee-only issues, that person might not be a campus security authority. Another area where I think we've had more than a little frustration in dealing with the Department of Education is they've said that directors of campus health and counseling centers can be CSAs. The challenge there, I think, is a lack of understanding on the Department of Education's part, particularly as it relates to counseling centers. In my experience, at least, working at both large and small institutions, directors of counseling centers are still serving as clinicians. And their supervision of other clinicians is work that happens within the scope of their licensure. It is more common, not necessarily that common, but more common to see directors of student health centers who are primarily administrators because of the scope of that work. But many of them as well are wearing two hats. And one of the more elegant responses, one of the ones I actually appreciated from the Department of Education, because they've had it in a number of places, where folks have said, well, I wear different hats, and I can't tell what hat I'm wearing at any given time. And the Department of Education's response has been, well, if you can't tell which hat you're wearing the CSA hat, which quickly leads to people saying, oh, maybe I can tell a little bit more clearly now when I'm in that administrative role versus when I'm in this other role.
When we're talking with this about the counselors, it borders on a disingenuous argument, to be quite frank. This notion of I can't tell when I'm treating somebody versus I can't tell when I'm teaching Psych 101. Because that's that thing. And the other one is when I'm serving as an administrator in the counseling center, somebody comes in to schedule an appointment, am I serving as a counselor? Well, there's that exception to the administrative support staff. You're acting more like a support staff. So you do really know. So John's spot on. It really comes from this notion of I don't want to report. And know that skeptic's view, I think, as John goes through more of this, the two things that I've always picked up on these amendments to Clery, and the parallels to Title IX we can address later if you're interested, are the view that it started with was the campus was hiding these crime statistics. And so that's been a consistent view of always, what are you trying not to tell us? What are you trying to keep under wraps? Why do you want this person to not say something and not have to be a reporter? What is it that you're afraid is going to get out there? So there's that one skeptic view. And then the other one, as they amend, I always feel like I know this to be true actually. It's as Congress learns more about how schools work, the more they learn how it works, then they go, oh, so that's how it works. So what can happen is PD can find a student drinking on campus. This is actually a really good analogy, because back in the day, it used to be you just had to report alcohol crimes. And then they found out that some PDs wouldn't issue a citation. They would issue a referral over to the student conduct office in lieu of a citation. So it's not technically a criminal act that they would report to a judge. It would just go over to student conduct. And so the congressional view of that was, Oh, so that's how you're hiding your alcohol statistics. So now you got to report all the alcohol policy violations. But that's not what we were really doing. What we were really doing was not crowding up our municipal courts with every tailgating event and addressing these things in educational and developmental ways for our students who are drinking. And we could do it faster, and we could do it more efficiently, and we could still address the behavior. But that's not the skeptic's view. The skeptic's view is you're trying to shade this stuff out. So that's that constant learning, plus this, oh, you have counselors that are also administrators and teach class. We didn't know that, so this is what we're going to do. So keep that kind of lens, because that's the lens the analysis comes through.
Some of the other groups that have been identified as explicitly as CSAs, and they're ones about which many campuses struggle for very understandable reasons philosophically, are victim advocates and who provide advocacy services for victims, particularly of sexual assault, members of sexual assault response teams as well. And part of why there's confusion there has to do with there are two groups on campus that we end up talking about. Group A is campus security authorities. That's the Clery Act language. Group B is responsible employees under Title IX. And that particular group operates differently under Title IX in some unique ways than it does in the Clery Act. But the other part of the Clery Act that is significant, and it's the part we think about less, are the ongoing disclosure requirements. We have a tendency to think about it primarily in the context of the ASR, but there are really three significant ongoing responsibilities. One very much does on most campuses, or all of these to a degree involve campus law enforcement, but the first is the daily crime log, which is very much about what is reported to campus law enforcement. And then there are the timely warnings. Timely warnings are a longstanding requirement of the Clery Act. And there it is a circumstance in which a crime has occurred in the past that had been reported to us, and we believe that that represents an ongoing threat to the campus community. And the newest one is the emergency notification requirement, and that is a requirement that Congress placed on us primarily as a result of Virginia Tech and Northern Illinois, those two shootings. And for me, one of the key differences between the timely warning and the emergency notification is the timely warning is something has already happened and we're concerned it's going to happen again. Emergency notification is we're in the middle of something bad happening or something is about to happen. And the reason I say about to happen is because the emergency notification piece is an all hazards policy. It's not just the active shooter that we think about from the Virginia Tech and Northern Illinois examples, but it runs the gamut from those sorts of active shooters to terrorists to tornadoes and fires. So it's a much broader obligation. But again, what triggers those timely warnings in particular is that the crime has been reported to one of those campus security authorities or local law enforcement. So like the statistics, it's triggering from the same place. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, there was one of the, I think, misconceptions that I think the Clerys had when they originally passed the legislation, and was that having this report in their hands was going to change student behavior. And they were wrong there, but that's not to say that there isn't a value in the report, but in my perspective, much of the value lies in the work that is done to put it together. The fact that it requires us to have a fuller understanding of crime on campus than we ever had before this. Even at institutions, because there were at that point a limited number of institutions that participated in the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, that those institutions had a much broader understanding of crime on campus. And the fact that we were, if we're doing it right, on an annual basis, looking carefully at our policies in very important areas. And in some cases, We're first developing them because the Department of Education demanded and Congress demanded that we have clear policies in those areas. So for me, its value lies less in the document itself and more in the process that we have to engage in order to produce it. I mentioned before there are two other elements that are probably worth touching on that aren't actually Clery, although the Department of Education now effectively pretends like they are for the purposes of enforcement. There's the fire safety element, which at most institutions is rolled right into Clery, even if it's someone different who's responsible for it. That's another one that is very much a product of a tragedy. Primarily the Seton Hall fire in New Jersey a number of years ago that claimed the lives of multiple college freshmen. And the other one is the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, which the Department of Education on more than one occasion has been faulted for its failure to enforce in any meaningful way, including by the Government Accountability Office. And so one of the things that they have chosen to do in recent years is simply to take the Clery Act team and place them or cede to them responsibility for that enforcement as well. So that's one of the things now that they're paying attention to, in addition to looking at the Clery Act issues when they're engaging in their reviews. If you look at their recent enforcement efforts, one of the most recent ones is at the University of Montana. That was one of the ones that got a lot of attention. Granted, that attention will be...
Say something more. I didn't mention this, but there is on your tables, there's a handout, it's a 2-page about the University of Montana. If you want to look at that, it's just kind of tells you it was the letter that was sent out, so that's what they all have a copy of there. So, oh, you don't have some in the back? I can get you those. Thank you.
One of the things that's worth noting there, and we've seen this now in a number of cases, the Department of Education launched its investigation of the University of Montana on the basis of multiple credible press reports about problems related to their handling of sexual assault cases. Those really high-profile cases, the Department of Education has no obligation to wait for a complaint. And that was the case at Penn State and their multi-million-dollar fine. Notre Dame. It is the case, although we're still early in the process, at Michigan State. The Department of Education doesn't have to wait around for somebody to complain if they see these issues. Even though they may ultimately receive complaints, they don't have to wait for them. And their enforcement approach, once they come knocking, is to look broadly and completely at your compliance. They are not limiting themselves to whatever narrow issue originally brought them to your doorstep. And one of the pieces that they have started implementing and making a common feature, at least of these major investigations, is language that sounds, and I'm confident intentionally so, sounds eerily like the NCAA's favorite phrase in their major cases. The NCAA's favorite phrase is lack of institutional control.
And there's been a slight distinction that I do want to point out. What John's talking about, and just to make sure we're all clear, and you may all know this, and if so, I apologize for making it redundant. But when we say the Department of Education is coming, we're talking about the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education is primarily the investigator when we're talking about the Title IX side of this thing. And so that broad application he's talking about is when that office or another office comes in as a result of, think Penn State, Baylor, Notre Dame, Michigan State, that broad. There has been a shift in the Title IX world when a complaint, a singular complaint comes in that they're looking at. This administration's Office of Civil Rights has become more targeted toward that complaint, whereas prior administrations, plural administrations, Bush and Obama, would tend to come in with that same broader look. This one is being more let's talk about this and see if there's a bigger problem first. But let's look at this problem and then see if there's a larger problem. But if it is that broad Michigan State-esque, they're going to come look at everything. And the scope is incredibly broad. I think that's important, like disability services, athletics, health science centers, employment things. Like they've got a broad brush they can paint with, yeah.
Yeah, that was, Lisa's point was they also have the authority to go back as far as you have records. Penn State tried to argue it first when the Department of Education requested records all the way back to 1998, which is when the first set of Sandusky issues on campus occurred. They said, but we're not required to maintain information for more than 7 years, to which the Department of Education's response was, that's correct. However, if you have maintained the information, you are required to turn it over. One of the things that the phrase that the Department of Education has now used in multiple cases is a lack of administrative capacity to comply with the Clery Act. And they are, in the case of the University of Montana, they are not blaming, and they're at the time a number of these things were happening, their Clery Act coordinator was the chief of campus police's secretary. They did not blame her for the issues. Their complaint was that the university failed to provide the necessary training and authority for this person to be successful. It's not this person's fault that the university set them up for failure. And in the case of Montana, Michigan State, and Penn State, there were senior administrators, and by senior I mean VP level and up, who possessed information they failed to provide to the appropriate parties. Another thing that we see pretty consistently in these cases is a failure to effectively identify and train, on some level, campus security authorities. Because if I don't know I'm a campus security authority and I don't know what it is I'm supposed to do, it's very difficult for me to do it. And in fact, in many cases, or in many circumstances, in a number of these cases, the Department of Education has said, these are all the violations we know about, but we have no idea how many more there are because these people didn't know what it was that they were supposed to do. So they've stressed the need for training. They have in a number of these cases, and they did in the Montana case. The timely warnings is one of the things they tend to focus on. Because we have historically thought about camp security authorities and the information that they collected in the context of the annual statistics, many institutions traditionally would worry about only collecting information from campus security authorities in the context of preparing annual statistics. But the Department of Education has begun to emphasize in a variety of places that it is important that campus security authorities understand their obligation to share information on an ongoing basis. When it comes to timely warnings, the Department of Education's guidance is you have to make a decision as an institution, a case-by-case analysis about whether or not to issue a timely warning. But you can't do that if you don't know that something has happened. The other piece that has been interesting in a number of these cases is that the Department of Education has faulted institutions in places for not. The other issue is you have a policy and you have described that policy in your annual security report. Even if that policy goes beyond the requirements of the Clery Act, once you've made that promise to students, you are obligated, and the rest of your campus community, you are obligated under the Clery Act to comply. So it's a violation to not do the thing you promised to do, even though the thing you promised to do you weren't required to do. So I think it becomes a reason for thinking carefully. Some institutions, and I think we've gotten better about this as a higher education community, for example, would say that they would do timely warnings for things that didn't occur in their Clery Act geography. Many institutions, they haven't stopped doing that, but they've stopped calling them timely warnings. They call them something else so that they reduce confusion on the part of the community. The other issue that certainly came up in a number of these cases, it's not just about counting things, but the problem is record keeping so that you can actually show and explain the statistics you have, and where you have choices, defend the choices that you've made. Why did we not issue a timely warning in this case? The Department of Education will say there are certainly circumstances in which it might appear on the surface that there's an obligation to issue a timely warning, but can you document the analysis that you engaged in that led you to reach a different conclusion, and those sort of paper trail pieces. And another one line, as I was rereading recently, particularly the Montana one that caught my attention, and I think will catch the attention of all senior administrators in the university, describing the failures of the University of Montana as it related to statistics in particular, which were very extensive. The Department of Education noted that their failures, quote, call the university's ability and willingness to properly administer the Title IV federal student aid program into serious question. So the Department of Education is not just talking, we're going to fine you, but there's an underlying issue here because the Clery Act is a requirement of your institution's participation in the federal student aid program, and suggesting that there is a clear connection between the two. And they did at Montana, and they have in other letters, really criticized institutions, and certainly Montana, they talked about a systemic failure to collect information from campus security authorities. And they said the true scope of the problems related to timely warning, as I noted before, can't even be understood without that information. And they talked about the fact that having an adequate system for collecting crime statistics from all required sources was fundamental to the goals of the Clery Act, and represented not a failure on the part of the police department, not a failure on the part of the Clery Act coordinator, but represented a university-wide failure to uphold the Clery Act. They dinged them a little bit about fire safety, not that that's important, but one of the things they noted is that as they looked back at these, while the university had taken steps to correct the problems, the reality was that there was no unringing the bell, that for a period of time these violations existed and the campus community was less safe as a result of those violations. And we have seen, and this started back under Arne Duncan when he was Secretary of Education, a very different approach on the part of the Department of Education when it comes to enforcement of the Clery Act through fines. Historically, fines for the Clery Act were quite low in terms of actual institutional fines. The fine figure is actually a broader figure within the Department of Education. It's not limited to the Clery Act. Although, interestingly, Congress recently changed it so that it gets recalculated every 2 years now. So it's it's over $50,000 a violation. But what was significant was the change that Arne Duncan brought and we've continued to see in how those fines are calculated. For the first 20 years of the history of the Clery Act, Department of Education would come in the rare cases they find institutions, they'd be, oh, you've got a problem with how you are reporting sexual assaults, and there were a number of sexual assaults that weren't reported. That's a serious problem, and we're going to fine you for that. And that would be one fine. They have moved to a model where if they see 5 sexual assaults that were not reported, each of those individual sexual assaults represents a serious violation for which the institution can be fined. And that's why we've seen these exploding fine amounts, and you get Penn State with $2 million plus, because they are counting much more aggressively these fines. And Penn State will tell you, and certainly Michigan State and Montana will tell you, that those fines are the tip of the iceberg in terms of what it costs the institution in order to deal with those and resolve those complaints, both in terms of the amount of staff time that was spent dealing with the Department of Education, dealing with the various activities that the Department of Education mandates. For example, in the case of University of Montana, have to go through every piece of paper that came in their campus police department and search for any other unreported crimes from a variety of other sources back over the better part of a decade. And that's all time that could be better spent doing other things. And the reputational hit that the institution takes. And these are not short investigations.
And the pending litigation.
Yeah.
It's going to be nonstop in some of these cases. I think the other piece, John, is as these cases have become more serious and gained more profile, the language in some of these letters that you mentioned regarding Title IV has become more ominous. And it's almost like some of the language we hear out of sport where I feel like we're moving closer and closer. Obviously, the death penalty is the withdrawal of all federal funding. And that's the death knell for anybody. And the question that I was hearing over this last 6 months when I would visit the folks in DC is eventually they'll become a fatigue. Like, how bad does it have to be? Because that's what you hear from constituents. Like, at what point do we just pull the plug? And for those of you who remember way back in the day, in the athletics world, was SMU, right? And I mean, it was devastating to the institution. It was devastating to the athletics program. There was a lot of bad that came out of that. Now, the institution didn't close its doors by losing athletics access, but it's that same sort of ominous tone of, at what point does somebody just become the poster child? And that's what I worry about, because is there the too big to fail theory?
Well, I think part of it is we've shifted from a period in which institutions could make the argument, look, we didn't understand this, this is complex. Many of the early enforcement cases involved small private institutions, very limited staff. That's a very different thing from a state flagship university trying to argue we didn't understand the basic requirements of a law that has been in place for 25 years. There's very little tolerance for that sort of argument at an institution like Michigan State, like Penn State, like the University of Montana. And I think that's part of why we're seeing this, we're beginning to see this ramping up of the language, is the sense that you should have known better. You made a choice not to do this in the way that it should have been done. Now, that's not always fair, but I think that's the attitude more and more the Department of Education is taking when these are basic fundamental questions. These aren't, we're not talking about issues that sort of fall at the edges and the gray zones of what the law requires. We're seeing things that cut right to the heart of the requirement of the law.
So I like to track these things from the 30,000-foot view, from the longitudinal view. And the longitudinal view is, okay, private school, you didn't get it, to, all right, now we're going to start fining more aggressively. Now we're going to change the way we count the fines, and now we're going to start talking about Title IV funding. That's the evolution of this. And so the more egregious, the more risk. That's just where we are.
You want to talk some about you want to talk a little bit about Title IX?
Yeah, let's spend a few minutes on that, and then I do want to open this up to see if anybody has any questions, if anybody wants to send any questions in. A couple of parallels I want to remind ourselves. When John was talking about that, the timely warnings versus the emergency notifications, and this idea that if we decide to expand that definition, we can call things whatever we want to call them, but we have to fulfill them. All these laws, much like court decisions, they set floors, not ceilings. They remind us of what we must do at a minimum. But as I regularly tell my students and my clients, if we do the bare minimum when we know the right thing is a little bit more than that, we'll eventually be legislated or litigated into doing more. Like that's how this always ends. And so when we talk about who is a campus security authority, they're telling us who at a minimum is a campus security authority, but that could be expanded. We could decide more people are if we were so inclined. If we're like, hey, we want to develop a system for these reports to be funneled in. Online reporting systems are the most common. Parallels between that are responsible employees. Now you're seeing the pendulum swinging more there on the Title IX side than you do on the campus security authority side. And that has a lot to do with the notion of, for Title IX, it's not statistical information. It's actual names of people. Sally came in and told me that she was sexually harassed or assaulted, or Bobby came in and told me that he's being harassed by another student or a faculty member, whatever. So a name is attached to that when it goes over to the Title IX office, as opposed to a stat. Here's a number. The accurate counting we can get in, that's a little in the weeds. I don't think you all are that interested in it. The other thing we're seeing in these same investigations from the Department of Education is the same language of this lack of institutional control, lack of addressing the issues you know about, particularly the sort of the usual suspects tend to be Greek life and athletics. And then you also see this capacity question, and that comes up in the timeliness and how we're handling these complaints. And so when you're saying, gosh, why did it's couched under due process. It's like, my due process took forever. Why is that? And they're like, why is that? And like, well, we only have one investigator for 12,000 students. And the Department of Education is like, why is that? Like, you just know. And that's why I wanted to point out that parallel at the very beginning with the Center for Safe Sport, because that was the question from Congress is, why do you only have 6? When you know you have 11 million people, like the numbers just don't match up. We used an algorithm based on past reporting. That's harder for us now because in education we know reporting is going up. There's just no question. The reports are coming in. So that lack of capacity, that lack of control, that lack of training, all of these parallels exist. There's some marginal differences. The last one I'll point out, and then I do want to take a moment and open it up to you all, is the issue of fines. In the Clery world, the fines have, as we just articulated, are out there. In the Title IX civil rights side, there is no technical fining that exists from them. It is on the table. It did come up in some of the groups out of DC that have asked me questions about it, like, why can't we fine for this? Why shouldn't we? You saw sort of a toe in the water approach at some of the decisions that came out over the last 3 or 4 years, where they would make in their voluntary agreement. That's just, when the OCR enters an agreement, they call it a voluntary resolution, which is really funny because it's not really voluntary. They're only asking to be polite. And so, but in some of those voluntary resolutions, they've instructed the school to pay restitution. Now, technically speaking, they don't have the authority to do that. But if you volunteer to agree to it. So that's their sort of toe in the water with, can we make you pay money? Because their only other hammer is the withdrawal of all federal funding. So they live in this world of, we can make it inconvenient for you and make you publicly shamed and make you enter this resolution that makes you do a lot of administrative work, or we can kill you. And those are our only 2 choices. And the Clery has the middle ground of, we can ding you for little things. We can ding you a lot, we can ding you a little. And so know that in the Title IX side, those same conversations are coming up. And Title IX will inevitably expand to all civil rights. So all of our protected classes. So just be cognizant that this is how the train is moving, and we need to be aware of that. Pendulum swinging, be damned. It's like the stock market, right? A friend of mine, I'll exhaust my stock knowledge very quickly, but a buddy of mine who does advise me in this world, he's like, in the long term, it always goes up. It does this a lot in the middle, but in the long term, look at the trajectory. Our long-term trajectory is this. Our long-term trajectory on marijuana is it's going to be legal. our long-term trajectory on gay rights and the recognition of sexual orientation and transgender is they're going to be recognized as protected classes. We can watch this happen here. The train has long pulled from the station. So we just need to prepare for that in the long term. Questions, thoughts, concerns? Yes.
You just mentioned that we have fines with Clery and not, fines with Clery and not with Title IX. Let me make sure I understand. So we have seen fines assessed where there were issues of sexual misconduct, but only on the fact that they didn't report it. For Clery, that's why they were fined, not basically fining on participation in the act itself.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Just want to make sure I understand.
Right. That's your ding on that comes for failure to report within the Clery Act sexual assaults that were reported to you that were not unfounded, as opposed to your mishandling of it. That comes in restitution. Well, actually, your fines end up coming. When you hear about a fine in the paper on that, it's not a fine per se, it's litigation. There's a settlement cost or a judgment against the institution to pay back cost to somebody who was removed or back cost to somebody who wasn't managed properly as a reporting party.
Well, and I think before we get to that, I think the other thing I will say as it relates to fines in the Clery Act is inevitably when this conversation happens, and in fact legislation was introduced a couple of years ago, would have also significantly increased the fines for the Clery Act. The belief that the penalty would get people's attention, and at one point, they were starting to toss out figures like $250,000. And some of the proposals as it related to fines for Title IX, they were talking about percentages of E&G budgets. So there's a belief on the part of some in Congress that that's the only thing that's going to get institutions' attention. So you were seeing these proposals, at least, to greatly increase the fines for the Clery Act and to go from nothing to incredibly significant fines for Title IX, go from 0 to something huge. And interestingly, the Office for Civil Rights has said they feel like the system they have now is sufficient for their needs, and have actually said, we don't think fines are going to make it easier for us to get the compliance we need, in part because this voluntary compliance tool actually works relatively effectively.
And conversely, you have individuals in Congress who are saying, no, we want you to be able to do this because that's a good bill for us to pass. The other thing that's happening, just so I'll just give you this little undertone, because whenever there's rumblings about something, I'm always like, is this a train pulling from the station, or is this just something we want to stick a pin in and be cognizant of it, is at our last Title IX conference. So ATICSA is the Association of Title IX Administrators. Full disclosure, I'm co-founder, serve on the advisory board. We had a meeting with some folks that several different government agencies. So every executive branch agency has an Office of Civil Rights. So NOAA, NASA, EPA, and a couple of other agencies sent representatives to be trained on Title IX, even though they're not governed under Title IX. But what they're talking about is, and there is a GAO task force that's working on this right now that I'm consulting with, is are they going to attach to, say, a NASA grant to an institution the requirements that it meets NASA's Office of Civil Rights interpretation of Title IX harassment? And so, good news for us, they're looking to ATICSA and the people that we already look to for guidance on this. They're not making up their own, at least. But the bad news is that's just one more agency. So know that what we're telling them is, hey, you don't really need to know who at a school in the engineering college was accused of harassing somebody else and how, like, the outcomes of that. You really just want to know, do you have policies in place that are compliant? Can you demonstrate that? And we'll attach that within the grant. You've already got enough complexities in how we get grants to ourselves. We don't need more of that. But I always like that sends a bell in my head going off of, oh no, like I'm just thinking about all the grants and how hard it is to get them already. Don't add a layer. Like at least don't add an insurmountable layer. And because that would obviously put us at odds. We already have to tell enough people what's going on. To tell one more agency would be I would worry about the lack of control we would have over that data.
Chief had a question.
Yes.
We're responsible for gathering statistics from every field trip, every overseas campus, every military base where OU has classes. I guess my question is, we send all these letters out to all these folks trying to get statistics, but, getting statistics from the federales is a non-entity. But is the fact that we send letters out and seek out this information and we never get anything back, is that enough to make them happy?
If you can document on an annual basis that you have requested the information and have not received anything in return. In fact, that actually came up in one of the first cases where the Department of Education significantly fined an institution was Eastern Michigan. Eastern Michigan, the reason their investigation started was very valid. There was a student who died under very suspicious circumstances. I think they ultimately concluded that it was foul play. But for more than a month, the university maintained, despite knowing that, that she died either of natural causes or suicide. That started the investigation. One of the things that Eastern Michigan said in its defense, that they had not published crime statistics from the Ypsilanti Police Department, was that the Ypsilanti Police Department wouldn't provide them statistics, to which the Department of Education said, well, show us where each year you asked. And as long as you can document, the Department of Education has acknowledged you and they don't have the power to compel these other agencies to comply. So as long as you can demonstrate that you made an annual good faith effort to request the information, that's where their analysis is going to stop. Is can you demonstrate that you did that? And I'll be the first to admit, and I've said this a couple of years ago when they did the 25th anniversary of the Clery Act, one of the areas of the law that is least helpful relates to this incredibly expansive definition of non-campus building and property. We spend far more resources trying to collect the information than there is any benefit measurable benefit to campus safety, and that effort could be much better spent in other areas. And I think most people who study the Clery Act and campus safety agree that the drawback is this is the world we live in. And the world we live in is that we have to document that we requested it each year and that we haven't received a reply, or we received a reply and the reply did not actually provide the information that we needed. They sent us information back, but it was useless.
So you have the online exclusion, but it's not going to roll back that far out and I would argue because of that skeptic's view. Because that center could be 2 blocks off campus and somebody's going to say, oh, it's not ours. And so it puts us in this untenable position.
We're working with our deans and folks that go on these field trips, the sponsors and stuff, to say, hey, look, if something happens, you need to let us know as a backup plan. But like I said, there are tons of outreach that OU does that we attempt to contact to gather the statistics, but we get no responses.
Well, and it's having unintended consequences. Even at many institutions are going up. Which hotel we stay at last year? We need to stay at a different one this year.
I mean, every sport team that goes and stays in a hotel, you got to gather statistics from that. Is there any changes coming that would?
It is far harder to roll things back, despite Lamar Alexander talking about one of the things. Lamar Alexander there has not been a head of the Senate Health Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, that better understood higher education than Lamar Alexander. And one of his favorites, and it's a publicity stunt, he has 2 favorite publicity stunts related to higher ed. One is he's got this taped up version of the FAFSA form that he likes to drop out and show how long it is when he's speaking. He did that at the American Enterprise Institute when he gave a talk there very recently. The other one is to roll in boxes upon boxes and boxes of regulations. And there's the meaningful examination of the regulation of higher education is something that Congress loves to talk about, and they've been talking about it for a long time. But it is far harder to go backward than it is to go forward. And so even when people like Lamar Alexander, who understand the issues, say that it's needed, and they agree that it's needed, actually having it happen, I don't hold my breath. And it goes all the way back to Henry Hyde in the early 90s. Even as they were passing the Clery Act, Hyde was talking about the need for a serious re-examination of the Clery Act. They sought input about regulation and where meaningful changes could be made, and the Clery Act was one of the areas where they got feedback, particularly on this issue. The challenge is the will to expend political capital on this particular issue, and the energy when there are lots of things that need to be done and very little's getting done.
One of the things, Chief, that when I was at a Clery conference in July, and James Moore was there, who's from the Department of Education, he said that we could use email for these crime stats because you can trace an email when it was sent, when it was opened and all of that, because we've been doing it by certified letters, which gets very expensive when you're sending out 400 or 500 certified letters. We're getting the green cards back so we can show that we did it, we sent it to them. But one of the things that Jim said at this conference was he did not think that that was enough, that you needed to reach out either by phone or by second email, say, hey, did you get our request, and try to get something back.
So I think one thing I want to make sure we draw the distinction between two is what you're talking about, which is having to collect these statistics around this hotel that we were in for like 3 nights, maybe one night. And because I think these two got mentioned in the same sentence, and I want to draw the distinction, and that and the person who took that group and the incidents that might have occurred during that trip.
There's two different.
And the training of those individuals, if I take my class on a field trip out to another institution to have them understand how community colleges work, and I bring them back, that is a trip. If something happens on that trip, I should report it. And I will say there's a very low tolerance both in the Clery world and the Title IX world to say, oh, well, that faculty member didn't know. You know, it was like one thing that was said, when in the real world, if you will, if we send our employees out in the corporate world on a venture under us and something occurs, we expect the coordinating employee to send us a report back that says, what happened on that trip? And if you really want to go, when the government doesn't know what to look at, they look at their own regulations, and then they look to the military. And when the military goes on an excursion, when you come back from the military an excursion, you write a report. This is everything that happened. And that report gets turned in, and that takes time, and they're well aware that it takes time. But you know, that I don't think we're going to be there. And then we got off the bus at 1422. You know, that's not going to happen. But it's amazing to me when I talk to my colleagues, and they'll be like, this thing happened, but they said they were going to tell somebody when they got back, so I didn't do it. That's not going to be deemed acceptable on either side of the coin.
Could you talk a little bit about the difference between timely warning and emergency notification, and when and how to determine to send one or the other, and the importance of record keeping? I know you talked a little bit about that, but just the difference in a timely warning and how it needs to be sent, who needs to get it, how the universities need to be making those decisions on sending timely warnings.
I'm just looking to get, because it just happens for the session this afternoon, I have a bunch of notes put together, so I'm trying to get to them, and then it's easier. Then I can talk in a more coherent way about this particular topic. So you've got timely warnings and you've got emergency notifications. As I mentioned, timely warnings have been around for have been a long-standing part of the Clery Act. Emergency notifications are more recent. Timely warnings are limited to Clery Act crimes and are limited to crimes that occur in the areas for which you have responsibility under the Clery Act. And in that case, you have to disseminate that information in a manner that's designed to reach the entire campus community. But you have a great deal of flexibility in how that's done. And institutions often use multiple tools for that, because what we're telling people is that we've had a rash of break-ins in into cars in the parking garage, and we want to be sure that you are aware of that. And in that case, you have to issue the warning once there is pertinent information available. You've determined these crimes have happened, have been reported, and they represent an ongoing threat. Emergency notifications, in part, as I said, it's all hazards, so it's broader. It is impacting anywhere on campus. And the language that's different as it relates to emergency notification, the institution is required to state clearly that they will issue those alerts immediately upon confirmation of the significant emergency or dangerous situation. So you have that, and in part it ties back to this idea that the emergency situation in question we're in the midst of it. That's the response that they were writing to. If you weren't following the original Virginia Tech case, clearly part of the criticism of Virginia Tech was that there were 2 people killed on campus very early in the morning, and they were aware of those starting at about shortly after 7. The shooter leaves campus for about 2 hours, and then returns, and then there is the second shooting incident in the academic building. And so there was a belief that if they had done something sooner, that second shooting might have been prevented. Now, to be fair to Virginia Tech, they thought they understood very differently that first shooting. They actually believed there was someone else who was responsible for that shooting. They didn't make the connection to this shooter until later. Now, by comparison, the emergency notification, it's happening now. So when emergency notification, the systems that institutions are using are a reflection of the kinds of emergencies we're talking about. This is why text messaging systems became suddenly something that everybody was trying to sell us. Yep. Loudspeaker systems. And we've actually always had these. And certainly we have them, having lived here, we have them in Oklahoma because we've always had emergency alarm systems for tornadoes. We have them in every building because fire safety systems are part of that as well. So I think that's the key difference. You might have a circumstance in which there are a series of crimes that have happened that you decide they reach the level of emergency notification. That have happened in the past, and you believe it's a string of them. But the timely warning is much more common. The other difference between, which is a significant one, between emergency notifications and timely warnings have to go out to the entire campus community. You do have the ability with emergency notifications to do a more targeted notification, provided your system allows you to do that. Yeah. In part.
Norman versus OKC.
Right. And again, historically, we've always done that. When there is a fire in the Memorial Union, every fire alarm on campus doesn't go off. The fire alarm here goes off. It's not always as simple with some of the other notification systems to be able to say, well, really, it's only these 4 buildings that are impacted. How can we communicate with just those folks? But there is that ability under emergency notification that doesn't exist under timely warnings.
Okay. We had one question that came in, but Mr. President?
In financial matters, we have audits, safety matters, and companies that have special audits. Is there an effective way to audit our processes under Clery?
One of the things that I think is valuable is, one, you already have a Clery Act compliance team. I think that putting together that multidisciplinary team that has the representatives, because often the issue is we have policies, but the policies don't match what we have. We've seen this at a number of institutions, don't match what they have in the annual security report. And because there are so many different offices that are developing policies.
And can you tell them how many policy statements we have to have in there, do you know?
Depends on how you like to count.
Yeah, it depends on what you count as a policy statement.
Over 100.
There are over 100 specific elements.
It depends on how many elements you have within a policy statement. That's the trouble of counting. This didn't start out like this. This was much shorter when it first started.
Yeah, the easiest way to explain it, in the original security report, there were 36 cells of statistical information that had to be provided. Now, if you were to write them all out, to add to it, then it's almost 700, if you were to put them all out. Now, granted, your report may not have 700 cells,
broken down into different
and because the Department of Education in one area said, well, you don't have to present it as a table. You still have to collect it that way, but you don't have to present it that way. I think the annual review of the policies, the biggest challenge is we don't know what we don't know as it relates particularly to campus security authorities. They're the best we can do, I believe, is ensure that we have made it clear who are the campus security authorities, and that is changing. Some of it, and we were talking with Lisa about this, some of it can be done sort of as a one-time thing in the sense that the director of student activities is always going to be a campus security authority. So some percentage of the campus security authorities don't change from year to year. We're able to identify them on the front end, and then saying, okay, what steps are we taking to ensure that they know what they're supposed to do in terms of training, and then have we eliminated to the extent possible we can barriers to them reporting so that we've made it as reasonable for them to do that as possible. The other part of it, there is some percentage of CSAs that do change from year to year because you've got the individuals like faculty advisors to student organizations or other advisors to student organizations who aren't otherwise CSAs. And I may be an advisor this year and not an advisor next year. So some of them, there are additional complexities to identifying them.
The other question that ties to something, John, you mentioned earlier is this idea of if you have several positions within a department or a college or a division that would identify as campus security authorities because of that significant responsibility for campus and student activities. And again, I want to reiterate what John said earlier. How they define significant student and campus activities is not how we define it. It's much broader. And so I don't know that I would, under an investigation, want to have to argue that point that, well, we don't think it's significant. Like, I don't know that that's the road we're going to go down. The second part of this question is, do we have to name everybody as a CSA in there, or can we just name one or two people in the department? And the answer, per John's comment earlier, is we can't shrink we can't tell somebody who is that they're not. What we could do, though, is say that that person, in order to meet their requirement of getting the information to the person who has to put the report together, could funnel it through some other CSA at that. So an associate dean, a department chair. I'm going to collect everything from my group, who are all CSAs, and then hand that over. Now, I want to draw the distinction very clearly now between that and a responsible employee under Title IX, in which case, if a student comes to me and says they're being harassed or they've been assaulted, I'm going to tell the Title IX office directly. I might also tell my person, and herein lies the crossover, because they're also reporting a crime to me, right? So inevitably, at least two more people are going to find out if we do it that way, as opposed to just one more person. So there's ways you can do this. I would want us to be intentional about it. That's my big, and not just intentional, but consistent. If we're going to do this for departments or colleges, then we're going to do it for all of them. It's not going to be this college does it this way and this college does it that way, because that's confusion abounding.
Yeah, I think the key point, as it relates to the question about CSAs, is that it is the function that they fulfill in the case of this significant responsibility for student campus activities It is the function that they fulfill that makes them a CSA, not some institutional choice. Now, you may have, and institutions have done this. In fact, the University of Montana has done this. They've identified sort of, I'll call them super CSAs, who serve as coordinators within a particular unit. And it's, to a degree, I think it also allows you to do the train-the-trainer model, that you might say these particular individuals everyone's gonna get the baseline, but these people are gonna be the people that we provide additional information to, so that when staff in that office have questions, they have someone in-house they can start with to ask their questions before they move on, in the hope that they are more comfortable in asking that question in that circumstance.
And the value to that is we don't want to underreport and give the impression that we're trying to hide stuff. But we also don't want to overreport. So having somebody where faculty member A, B, and C all learned the same thing from the same person and they send it in, you might not have any way to know that that's 3 of the exact same thing, but somebody in that department would. They'd be able to go, oh, that's the same student they said came and talked to him. So this is really just 1 report of this, not 3. Because you can get dinged for over-reporting. It's inaccuracy that you can get dinged for, not just under-reporting.
They hate under-reporting more, to be fair.
We have about 10 more minutes. Did you have any other questions?
Yeah, I'm sure all of us oversee several groups that have student leaders or various advisors that go off into the world and come back. Do you have some draft of best practice as to what sort of things should be communicated from a chair or a dean to these groups, and then what sort of reporting and what time frame we should request back?
So, yes, we do. We have online CSA training now. It's through our LMS system. One of the things that I worked with our HR department this summer is to put in all of our job descriptions of the positions that we have identified as being a CSA on our campus. It now says in their job description that this job is considered a campus security authority.
And that's for the Norman campus.
That Norman campus, I'm talking Norman campus only. Then, once someone is hired in that position now, it is on the EPAP, the electronic personnel action form. Am I getting that right? So now they have to check a box now that they have to take this annual training, and it's required, just like the Title IX training or something like that, and so they take this training online. Before, I was having to gather all this information by hand and keep it on an Excel data spreadsheet, and it was very difficult. We have over 1,200 CSAs identified at OU. Now, the problem becomes with this is I don't always know what professors are taking students on repeated use or short stay-away trips. So I work with the dean assistants, and at the beginning of each year, we have in our org sync now that Student Life does, we have org sync. We work together with our Clery Act Compliance Committee. We send out the information to everyone who's been identified as a CSA and to our deans, directors, VPs, and then asking them to gather the information on what trips were taken the previous calendar year. And then from that information, that is what chief staff uses to go and send out the information asking for the crime stats. It is also from that information that I get the names of the professors who are taking trips, and I can make sure that those individuals get enrolled, and sometimes we have to do those enrollments manually. I'm also thinking that a good way that I can do this, because I get all of this information on the back end, these trips have already been taken, I'm hoping they've already gone through their training, and hope to me is not a plan. What I want to start doing now is I believe that everybody should have, especially in academics, is they should be building into their budgets what trips are going to be taking that semester with students. So they should have built in, we're taking a trip to China this year, so I know who that professor is going to be at the beginning of that year, and I can make sure that that professor is going through the CSA online training before they take students. We do that very well with our international professors that our international studies, and we do all their training with them before they go over there. But this is the kind of group that I have a little bit of difficult time catching, because I can't put that CSA language in every single professor's job description, Because again, they recommend you don't do that because that can get you in trouble if you just say, everybody on campus is a CSA.
Yeah, so
Then that's not what you want to do.
So let me add an element to that. So the CSA requirements for faculty or staff that take trips, and as a faculty member, former faculty member, as an adjunct now, but as a staff member who took students on day trips and overnight trips, there's a broader piece. And you talked about like the National Student Exchange and NAFSA, the International Educators Group. There's broader implications for what can happen when you take a student on a trip. Like, do our faculty know what to do besides call 911 if a student gets injured? If they, we saw that. What do we know what to do when a student gets arrested for felony murder while in another country? Washington State does now, right? I mean, that happened, and now they have a protocol for it. But so there's much more. What if a student becomes depressed or suicidal? Like, do they know what to do? Have they put this in place? And so it becomes this. This is one element of a broader conversation. So making sure we understand these responsibilities. And I know for some, when I was first bringing this up when we were at Carolina, they're like, well, nobody's going to want to take anybody on trips anymore. And I was like, it's not terrifying, but I'd rather be prepared, right? It's why we do fire drills, is so that we all know what to do when it happens. The likelihood is infinitely low until, I'll speak for myself, I was in Charleston and a student fell over the barrier into the battery and suffered a very severe injury. But I knew what to do because we had developed protocols for it. In fact, we had a book that told me, do this, then do this, then do this. And we walked through our protocols. And that's how EMTs work. It's how all emergency people work. And we practice it one time. So when it really happens, we know what to do. So it's a broader piece than just this one requirement that we want to make sure everybody's aware of. And I hear my colleagues still that are like, I don't want to do all that. I'm just taking them here for a few hours, right? And then you're like, yes, because that's when it's going to go wrong, right?
Well, and I think the thing that I would add is that it's a relatively small portion of the total number of trips that are going to have Clery Act implications.
Right.
But the implications as they relate to Title IX are going to be much more consistent. Implications about potential institutional liability and also simply the institution being prepared to act in a manner that recognizes our moral and ethical obligations to our students, forget our legal and potential tort liability.
Okay, we have 2 more minutes. If any other questions? Not? Then thank you guys for being here. I appreciate it. They'll probably be hanging around here. We do have a break between our next session.
Yeah, and let me end by saying TNG, which is the NCRM group, we are the consulting group to OU. So we work for you. So as you have other issues, you can certainly send them through the GC or the Title IX office, tend to be who we hear a lot from. But if you have questions, you can feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to help. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you guys.
not. I work with as a consultant to the United States Center for Safe Sport.
Okay, I'm gonna say, and he's the person who stole Amy from us. Is that what you put here in the?
As I pointed out in the last session, Amy was stolen after I left. I blame Michael Henry.
Her boss didn't.
But there's a guy named Jake at Hutchinson Community College in Hutchinson, Kansas, who always posts occasionally things that he's just funny. So Brett Ring was there when we were talking about that guy. He's like, blah, blah, blah. That's
Yeah.
They put, this article reminds me of two favorite expressions. Everyone's entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. Daniel Moynihan. And the second one is, arguing with insert subject here is like playing chess with a pit. We might have to stand up.
Thank you all for coming. They are bringing in some more chairs.
Yeah.
We have a really great group here, and so I appreciate you all being here. For those of you that may not know me, my name is Lisa Teal. I'm the emergency manager for the Norman campus, and I am also the Clery compliance officer for the Norman campus. Rachel is here from HSC campus, as well as Joe? Joe is also here. They take care of Clery compliance at the HSC brought in two great guys to speak to you. And I'll introduce them to you very quickly, and then I'll let them take over because we only have an hour of your time for this one. Scott Lewis is a partner with the NCHERM Group. He is a co-founder and advisory board member for the Association for Title IX Administrators and the National Behavior Intervention Team Association. He has served as a special advisor to St. Mary's College, assistant vice provost at the University of South Carolina, and as student conduct and res life administrator at Texas A&M. He's one of the most in-demand speakers across the country. He has served as a keynote speaker at national and international conferences. He has trained thousands of faculty and staff members on how to prevent, address, and properly report incidents on campus. And he is also a law enforcement trainer on how to investigate sensitive matters such as abuse and assault. He presents a lot at schools and campuses, just like he's doing here. He talks about things like legal, judicial, risk management issues, as well as policy development and implementation. He serves as an author and editor in a number of areas, including legal issues in higher education, campus safety and student development, campus conduct board training, and other education issues. And then he also helps his clients with overseas and conducts investigations and hearings for student, staff, faculty misconduct, and has investigated 1,000 of those allegations of misconduct. Also with Scott is Dr. John Wesley Lowry. He joined the NCHERM Group as an affiliate in August of 2009. He is a full professor in the Student Affairs and Higher Education Department at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He previously served as faculty at Oklahoma State University, but we'll skip that. His first faculty appointment was the University of South Carolina, where he taught and coordinated in higher education and student affairs programs. He has a master's degree in student personnel services from the University of South Carolina, an undergraduate degree in religious studies from the University of Virginia, and he earned his doctorate at Bowling Green State University in higher education administration. Throughout his career, he has served on several boards of directors and previously chaired the ASJA's Legislative Issues and Resolutions Committee, as well as co-chairing the Inter-Association Task Force on the National Baseline Study on Campus Sexual Assaults. Before beginning his doctoral work in 1996, he was director of Res Life at Adrian College in Michigan and University Judicial Administrator at WashU, which is the Washington University in St. Louis. And with no further ado, I will turn this over to Scott and John.
Hi, we are probably going to stand up both to project better because the microphones are actually for the live stream. They're not for you. So for the folks in the back, you are our litmus test on whether or not we can be heard or not, and we'll do our best. If we...
Italy says they can barely hear you.
Italy said, well, okay, that's a microphone. That's not me. So...
They heard that. So
Is that better? Can Italy hear me better now? Let's see.
I can hear great now.
Okay, great.
right.
There we go. Sound problem fixed. If you can't hear John or I, please let us know. A couple of other things. I know we've got campus security authorities, and we're going to talk about overlap into different areas. In the time when we were talking with Lisa about this session in particular, we really do want this to have a dialogue element to it. So as you have questions or concerns of any of these areas, please raise them. I want to make sure we have a good conversation that addresses the issues. It's not just about Clery, but it's about the overlap with many other areas. So a couple of other pieces I'll throw onto the work that we do at the NCRM group is anything that brings risk to the institution. Typically behavioral risk is what we focus on. Two other pieces I'll throw out there to kind of tack a little bit of, I guess, street cred to my resume is myself and my partners, we were also the consultants that were the primary contributors to the You Are Not Alone report from the Obama-Biden White House. And we also wrote the book on BIT. So behavior intervention teams as they exist today didn't exist before in that form before 2003 when we sort of created the rubric that actually OU uses. And so we've written a ton of model policies in this area and do a lot of work with some congressional areas. John has probably forgotten more about legislation than most of us know and the purpose behind it. So we always kind of go back to what is the history and how did we get here, because that is always really pertinent as well. And then in the Title IX arena, it's obviously one of the hottest topics. Harm to self, harm to others, and sexual misconduct are where most of us are spending the bulk of our time in terms of response. That's institutionally why. That seems to be our biggest exposure points right now. And so I want to open it up to that. In talking today, we spent the last hour and a half before you came in here with the executive admin, president's cabinet, deans, et cetera, talking about these issues, particularly the Clery issue at a sort of a global level, and drawing a lot of parallels between what's happening with responsible reporting for campus security authorities, of which all of you are, and what does that mean to be a campus security authority versus a responsible employee or mandatory reporter, depending on who you're reading, under Title IX, versus what I loved you brought up at the end, John, sort of the moral and ethical obligation that typically comes with BIT and care teams, and the fact that we should be interested in when people are causing harm or are being harmed, and addressing those issues at a much more humane and human level than sometimes institutions shy away from for concern of liability. And so I want to make sure we address those things as well. Anything you want to add to that?
No, well, yeah, I do think one thing we're really going to try to talk about and tease apart is there is naturally confusion that people have about understanding sort of where Title IX starts and stops and where Clery begins, where they overlap, where they are distinct. That's one of the things that we know that there are questions about, that we want to be sure by the end of this hour we've helped you understand that particular element a little bit better.
So let's take a second and sort of open up. We should also understand Clery is broader than Title IX. I'm not going to turn this into a Title IX higher ed law session. Title IX is a gender equity law that focuses on access to education being barred in some form or fashion on the basis of sex. If they were writing the law today, they would say gender, but they didn't, because it was 1970 to 72, and they didn't talk about gender the way we talk about gender today. And so that's obviously a real sticking point with this administration. As I told the last group, this is my sort of soapboxy moment, so just apologize right now. It's like, the analogy I used with the last group was the stock market. You know, right now we're in the middle of a civil rights era, and when that happens, pendulums swing back and forth, things happen, and people get frustrated because change isn't moving fast enough. When we talk about issues of gender and race and ethnicity and national origin. But what I told the other group, it's my buddy who does do my stock market analysis for me. The market, I was going to do it the wrong way. It always goes like this. The market always goes up. It has forever. Like, it goes like this every day, but it always goes like this. And so the train of gender equity has long pulled from the station. The train of gay rights has long pulled from the station. The train of the legalization of marijuana has long pulled from the station. It's going to happen. There will be this along the way, but it's done. The movements toward better discussions around ethnicity and national origin and racial equality, it's moving in the right direction. It just doesn't move as fast as some of us would like. But to be resistant to it is to put yourself under the train. So you can be on the train or you can be under the train, but the train is moving. So if you're back at the station, you're not going to be employed very long. That's how that ends too. So these are your choices as we move forward. So Title IX as a law has turned its focus as of late more toward the issues of sexual harassment and sexual assault and sexual abuse. And it's okay. Okay. Has turned its focus more toward those, but I want us to make sure, and I would talk to the folks who have any influence into academic units, so I probably should have brought this up in the last session too, that we don't turn a blind eye to the equity provisions in program offerings. When we have disproportionate populations existing in certain academic programs, certain non-academic groups, with the exception of Greek life, who has an exemption. But when we see one group, and the usual suspects are like nursing, teaching, engineering, science, math, why is that? Know that that is still on the radar. It's not just athletics. When we think about how the experience of someone going through that on the basis of gender still exists. And so I don't want us to forget that. We were trying to draw this cool Venn diagram I failed miserably on like where a CSA is versus a Title IX responsible employee versus who should report bit stuff versus who has like zero obligation whatsoever. And it looked like an olive for a little while, and then it looked like an olive on, like if you were on crack, I guess, for a little while. It just didn't work. But I mean, the thumbnail sketch I basically like to tell folks is, if you're a responsible employee under Title IX, you might not be a CSA. But if you're a CSA, you're probably a responsible employee under Title IX. And the difference and the confusion is what you have to report. And maybe for everyone in here, it's not as confusing, but there is a lot of discussion about like the notion of statistical reporting versus names and how to not confuse that. And so when we get into the weeds, and John, I want you to comment on this notion of the multidisciplinary nature of getting a group together to ensure that what's being reported is not being over or underreported, and how that's evolved.
I think one thing I want to start out by saying, while right now we're seeing perhaps we're in that state of great volatility as it relates to Title IX, when it comes to the Clery Act, that's not really our experience. It doesn't, we go from administration to administration, Republican to Democrat, liberal to conservative, and they all agree that institutions ought to do a better job about reporting campus crime. It's not like we have anything to look forward to. You know, it's not, oh, if we can just get to the next administration, then these issues will clear themselves up. This is campus crime in this context is a nonpartisan issue, and we get beat up by both sides about those issues. So we don't have quite the same volatility there. And there is, I think, certainly you have that complexity of you have response. We used to talk about it in higher education groups would often comment pre-2011 when we had this renewed emphasis on Title IX. Prior to that, we would complain regularly about how broad the definition of CSA was and how there was no other group on campus that was as broad for which we had reporting requirements. And then everything shifted for responsible employees, really primarily as it related to initially faculty and the fact that at least many faculty meet the definition of responsible employee. But with the Clery Act and the obligation of CSAs under the Clery Act, what we're primarily talking about is providing basic information for statistical purposes, which is not names, it's what is alleged to have happened, where did it happen, and when did it happen, so that it can be appropriately recorded. Now, the one complexity that comes in has to do with timely warnings, and there are a small set of crimes for which a small set of crimes, not in the sense of I can tell you it's only these three categories, but a small set of the crimes that actually occur on campus, which represent an ongoing threat to the campus community, and the institution's obligations there are not limited just to that annual counting of statistics. And that's probably the place where the greatest complexity comes in, is figuring out how, if we're only collecting information that is scrubbed of all identifying information, what process do we need for that small set of cases that may actually represent an area where we have an obligation for a timely warning. The other challenge that comes in, inevitably in this conversation where we're talking about people who are responsible employees and CSAs, depending on the system the institution has in place, you're obligated to report that incident in some form, often in different forms, to two different people. And the Title IX office is in turn required, they are CSAs, so they have to report something. And how do we make sure that we're doing that in a way that doesn't unnecessarily count the same incident multiple times? Now, that's always been an issue under the Clery Act, because there was always the potential that a student might start out by telling their RA about an incident, and that RA would say, well, you know, that's a violation of the Code of Student Conduct. You really ought to, let's go and let's report this to the Code of Student Conduct Office. So you now have 2 reports in that case.
And then they tell their favorite professor and their academic advisor, and then we end up with this potential of multiples.
Potential, yeah, it sort of spins out, but it's always been the case that that was an issue. The difference is when it comes to CSAs and responsibilities under Title IX, it's baked in to the way the system is set up, and it becomes something that institutions have to be attuned to.
So the other balance to that we hear a lot, and certainly through ATIXA and the organizations that we work with through ATIXA, we hear a lot as the flip side of the more, in particular, I'll say it's focused on students, but the same applications would apply to employees and faculty. The more I know as a reporting party, people that are going to find this out, the more that could have a chilling effect on reporting. And so both Title IX, and I think to a lesser extent, it's almost like Clery and 9 here, have carved out the distinction of privilege. So if the communication to you is a privileged communication, you're a medical professional, you're clergy, you're someone who would have legally recognized privilege, then you're exempt. In fact, you can't tell unless it reaches that notion of imminent harm. The Tarasoff line is what it's called. If it crosses that line, then you would have to notify law enforcement anyway, because you believe there is an immediate and imminent risk, not to the community and under Tarasoff, to someone. It doesn't have to be to the greater group. And so, but that's a law enforcement report. But most things don't get to that level. And so you have mental health professionals, medical professionals, certified licensed social work folks, all of those who are exempted from this reporting requirement for information they learn. Now, I think the tension in Clery has to do with its statistical data. It's not names like it is under 9.
Well, and part of the tension comes in because there was the Department of Education, when they received pushback on some of their definitions of responsible employee, chose to expand those carve-outs in ways that have not been done under the Clery Act. So you have individuals who are treated differently under Title IX than they are as camp security authorities. The differences are not as significant as they seem on the surface when you remember that the only reporting that's required of CSAs is that basic information. They're not required to provide, under federal law, personally identifiable information if that's not what the person who reveals the information to them wants. It's simply the most basic of information, and the institution's only obligation is to say, was this a report that was made in good faith?
Right.
Because that's the obligation. The Clery Act is, I think we sometimes lose track. This is the Clery Act statistics in the case of things like sexual assault. These are the crimes that have been reported to us. Not saying they've happened, we've not reached a determination, but someone has made a good faith report. Right. And that's what that's a count of.
So I'm going to pause for a moment there and say, bless you, what questions might you have, thoughts, concerns? Amy?
Mine is, as you know, from the Title IX perspective, and I'm sure other CSAs get this as well, somebody gives you a report that maybe doesn't include the time or the date. They say, I was sexually assaulted in my residence hall last August or last year or something like that. When you're not getting sort of all this who, what, where, when, why, specifically, what do you do with that? Do you still report and just say, but I don't have a specific time?
As the Title IX officer or as a responsible employer as a CSA?
As a CSA.
As a CSA, that would be, John?
My argument in the CSA is yes, because in part it was reported to, when it gets counted is based on when it's reported. I think the information that you provide about when exactly it occurred is based on the information that you have. Where the issue becomes more significant really is where detail becomes important actually is location. Because the student says, I was sexually assaulted in my apartment, then it becomes a question of, do we understand clearly that that was a university-owned apartment, or was that an apartment complex 3 blocks away? Because that would determine whether or not it gets counted. But that becomes much less of an issue from a Title IX perspective, potentially.
Yeah, in fact, I would make the argument where, 9 would not trump Clery, but I would want it functionally to trump Clery is, if you are not the campus's investigator, then you're not an investigator. And I would not want any CSA, of all the CSAs, the 1,200 or so that exist at OU, to say, well, I've got this checklist of things I must ask now, because speaking as an investigator and someone who's this is very near and dear to my heart, you may well unintentionally do harm to someone psychologically that does 2 things. 1, it hurts somebody, and 2, it can impede our investigation. And I'll add 1, and 3, it can give them a false impression that the institution doesn't want to proceed if they would want to, that there's some chilling effect that might have on their wanting to proceed. And nobody ever does that on purpose. It's done unintentionally in the fashion in which questions are asked and the impression you may give off. So if you don't know, you don't know, and it's not your job to find out. Even though, for Clery, they're going to be like, well, where was it? You don't have to know that. That's not a requirement. It's you have to report it if you know it. And so I want to make sure we draw that distinction with everyone, that I don't want everybody suddenly becoming, and I'm preaching to the choir in here a lot, I realize that, but I don't want everybody suddenly thinking, you know what? I'm going to put my investigator hat on and do a little digging. Like, no, don't. Unless you're an investigator, in which case, even then, if you were an institutional investigator and they just cold called you and reported it, you're not the investigator for that. And the analogy I use, I do a fair amount of training of faculty, and I remind them that I adjunct now. And so one of the schools I adjunct at in Colorado, I actually trained all the investigators at that school and their Title IX coordinator and their law enforcement on how to do investigations. And their Title IX coordinator, a guy named Dan, and he was like, Scott, if a student comes up to you after class and they're like, Professor Lewis, I was sexually assaulted, I Googled you, I know your work. He's like, if anybody knows how to ask the questions, it's you. And my response was, yeah, but that's not why you hired me. See, you hired me to teach political science. And so if you would like to hire me as an investigator, that's a different rate than the adjunct rate. And so let's begin with that conversation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to report it as I learned. Like, I'm not going to ask a lot of questions. This is the data. I'm going to make sure they know who I have to tell. I'm going to tell Dan. I'm going to tell the Clery. I'm going to fill my Clery report, and then I'm done. Like, I have fulfilled my responsibilities. Give them the brochure, report it, and I'm out. And then I'm just going to be a good human, supportive person like I can be. Nothing stems from that? All right.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I guess with Clery, the specificity on campus of where it happens, it's kind of where we found ourselves in a wiggly place, tackling it specifically, is if it happens in a residence hall, how important is that it's just listed as it happened on a campus residence hall, or that it happened specifically in this building, on this floor, in that kind of like what?
From a Clery Act perspective,
Right.
if I was looking at it as the person who had to determine whether or not it needed to be counted, knowing that it happened on campus and it happened in an on-campus residence hall is the information that's actually necessary in order to make a determination about whether or not it goes in the statistics. But again, this is one of those places where what you need from CSAs and for statistical purposes under the Clery Act and what you need from Title IX, from a Title IX perspective, are very different.
Yeah, from 9, I need to know which one it was. Are we establishing pattern behavior? Do we have repeated reporting? Is this a repeated reporter? Is the respondent the same? So we do need that information, not necessarily so we can go knock on doors and invade people's rights, but the crossover goes back here. If it's the same person, if it's the same building, now we go back over to Clery and we're back into timely warning or emergency notification questions. And this is the crossover that has to occur, and it's the dialogue that has to happen. But you would tell one and one the other, and like, Bobby's going to be like, oh, that's another one. Clery, what do you think? And then law enforcement gets involved and
But for the initial, just an on-campus resident.
stat there, where specifically here.
Okay.
That's going to be the signal. Well, he's going to point at me when it's Clery stuff, and I'm going to point at him.
Can you guys speak up a little bit? They're having a hard time hearing you at HSC.
We'll try.
Yes.
Just to understand correctly, so if we know all that information, like where it exactly happened in the dorm room or residence hall, we would just be very broad with Clery, very specific with the investigator, and then if Title IX decided that Clery needs to be in contact, like that's not up to us, that's up to Title IX and Clery.
Yeah. So Clery is never going to be, the Clery person is not going to be reaching out to the parties to clarify things. That'll be a 9 office job. And I need to ask this question, who's we?
Oh, you advocates?
Okay.
So we're the advocacy branch. This is
So,
complicated for us because you already mentioned the chilling effect.
right.
It's been a problem.
Yeah, so the situation, there's a couple of ways we can manage this. In advocates, if you're not protected by privilege, then the institution can carve you out as non-responsible employees and leave you in as CSAs.
Yeah.
I believe that is.
That is what, I happen to know that's exactly what you do.
That's what we did, yes.
Yeah. Having worked with this office for a number of years, that is your position, even though you're may not be privileged information.
Right.
So there's that. Just so you know, as you reach out into the advocacy community, there's a lot of question right now as to what's privileged and what's not privileged that sort of came to light in, and I'm not going to belabor this, and I don't want to turn this into like legal procedure 101, but it was in an early motion for an advocate to be removed personally from a case in Ohio dealing with a health science center. And the question was, did what the advocate know in her interactions with the reporting party constitute privileged information when she knew the reporting party lied in a hearing that was the determinative lie that got the guy kicked out of medical school? And the court in that case, in not exempting the advocate from personal liability, not professional liability, personal liability, sort of didn't comment really specifically, but gave a very big hint of, hey, if this is something you could have known other than that interaction, it's not protected. So that's an interesting piece that you start, the ripple effect of that is, are people talking about it in the residence hall anyway, right? Is there another way we're going to find out where this is anywho, right? I mean, that's kind of how it's going to go down. But we look at those little litmus tests, and that gives us, and that's not one of the Sixth Circuit courts that's like off the rails right now. That's a legitimate, thoughtful, I probably shouldn't, this is live stream, not tape, good. But that's one of the judges that I would say was very thoughtful about this and thinking, wow, this had the profound effect being weighed more appropriately than in some of the other Sixth Circuit cases.
And quick clarification, if people asking questions could either speak up or if you guys can repeat it, that's what they're having.
Oh, that's what I was trying to do is like, who are they? And the question was about what do we have to tell? That's going to be a recurring theme. Sorry, HSE.
But they're hearing you guys fine.
What else?
Deanna has a question in Italy, but we're delayed with her.
It's because it's Friday afternoon there.
You're lucky she's here.
I'm assuming with, a glass of red wine and some good bread.
I
really
worked under
hope.
that assumption from the beginning. As soon as they said Italy's here, and I was like, what time is it there?
6:30.
Scott, I don't have a question, but just, one of the things that I know that our advocates are dealing with and we're dealing with, and I know there's a training this afternoon specifically for it with the law enforcement and the police department on campus. I think clarifying some of what you've told us here this morning and informed the advocates of ensuring that they're on the same page, because what we're getting, what we've gotten in the past is, we would call, make a report based on what Amy told us, something happened in August. And I mean, initially we were getting requests back from the police department saying, hey, could you reach back to that person and request more information? And that's not what we want our CSAs to be doing.
Correct.
And as it relates to the designation of a specific facility on campus, whether that's a residence hall or a building, has an extremely chilling effect, because you go in and to what you believe is an individual who is confidential as an advocate, and then it shows up on the front page of the OU Daily, our campus newspaper 2 days later, that was a sexual assault that occurred in this building. And those are just devastating for the individuals involved. And the police our police are asking for a lot of information. So I'm hoping your education this afternoon is helpful, but ensuring that they're on the same page with what you shared here this morning with the advocates would be extremely helpful.
Right.
It's managing this whole process.
Well, there's that, and the other side of it is, and let me take it to another step, Bobby, the issue of our student journalists understanding that when they put something out there, we need to not be thrown under the bus, and this has to do with whoever's advising it, in terms of they may well have learned that this happened in Smith Hall by virtue of hearing confirmed statements from multiple students who live in Smith Hall who are directly related to it, as opposed to the poor reporting party who went to an advocate, said this, advocate said, I'm not going to tell anybody, told Title IX office, what they knew, told CSA or Clery, we didn't tell anybody, but then you're dealing with the fallout of what the hell, and then you got to have this really uncomfortable conversation about, well, who else have you talked to, and did you put anything out in social media, and perhaps your friends aren't as close, aren't as nice as you think they are, and it gets in this weird point. So accuracy in journalism, like I would make them to distinguish that this did not come from an OU official, because that helps us a lot. That takes away that other chilling effect.
Well, in this case, the PD's taking that information.
Right. No, I'm saying, I was giving you the other analogy of when it's not us. Now, if PD's saying, and honestly, I'm less, maybe I shouldn't be, but I'm less concerned about if PD is going back to the CSA versus through Res Life, because I think through stuff like this, y'all know enough to go like, no, I'm not going to do that. Then if it was reported to, Professor Johnson in the psychology department, and then PD calls Professor Johnson and says, hey, will you ask them where this happened? I think your average faculty member is going to be like, police department just asked me to ask somebody a question. I'm going to ask them a question because I'm not the police. And so there's that piece of the education too of, hey, if you get that kind of question and you're not comfortable, and even if you are comfortable, call Title IX. Because let us run interference for you on that, because that's not the way we are going to talk about that in the next session.
And I'll just add, we had a specific incident where I think our office reported as the CSA, didn't give any personally identifiable information, and then it came up on the crime log, and the police, I guess, commented and said, oh, OU Title IX told us this, but they didn't tell us anything that would help us. So just reminding them of that, not to throw CSAs under the bus, because we're all trying to do the best we can.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the common goal under Clery, whether it is, and John, you'll speak to this better than I will, whether Clery is serving in it, and I loved what you said earlier, I think it bears repeating, the initial purpose of Clery in terms of institutional selection by a student or their parents versus what it's actually doing. Will you comment that really quickly, please?
Well, it was I have met the Clerys on multiple occasions over the years. I do a lot of work with the Clery Center. I remember in mid-90s, I was working at Adrian College. Lisa mentioned I worked at Adrian College. I picked up my phone one day, and it was Jeannie Clery's father, Howard, who spent about a half hour mainly yelling at me. He was kind of a loud guy. He wasn't angry with me, but they thought genuinely that people would get this annual security report, which they originally envisioned, and it originally was something much shorter than it is today. It was a small pamphlet. That they would get that information and that people would make decisions that would allow them to make better choices. And the reality is that's not how particularly traditional age college students work. One of the things we know, psychologically speaking, is the ability to accurately judge risk is actually developed in the early 20s, early to mid 20s. And the value rests not so much in people reading the statistics, but the value rests in us having a broader understanding of what is happening on campus so that we can respond appropriately. And I think part of the natural challenge is the primary ways in which campus law enforcement and law enforcement more broadly respond to crime is by preventing and investigating crime. And the Clery Act, the reason they want information from all of those CSAs is so that we have a broader picture of what is happening on our campus. Not so we will investigate from a criminal perspective everything that happens on our campus. And that's a distinction that naturally, because it's not the place they come from, that it can sometimes take law enforcement, it runs counter to everything about what they do.
Because honestly speaking, cost, reputation, convenience, those are far more impactful things about individual decision making on what school you're going to go to. When you were picking where you went to undergrad, you didn't pull up the annual security report and go, I wonder if their policies are very thorough in the area of Title IX. Like that's not, how many burglaries happened or motor vehicle, like that's not how you made the decision. It was made on other factors that were far more personal, starting with money. A lot of it starts with money, and we're talking to OU here, but think about rural community college. Access to education is massive. And so I really appreciated at the institutions I worked at, as Clery was evolving, exactly what John was talking about. What it did was it opened up a really good conversation amongst multiple areas on campus where the silos started breaking down. But to be honest, we're slow learners despite being in education. It takes Virginia Tech for us to really have a moment where we go, maybe we shouldn't have such siloed communication about dangerous things on campus. And we're still having that conversation today. I don't know what that was.
I think it was the projector.
I was like, my phone's never made that noise before. Good. So I think that having those conversations and wanting to be accurate gives us an accurate look at where things might be happening on campus, as opposed to getting all wrapped up in, is this going to make our institution look good or bad? I remember having a big discussion with one of my first presidents because our institutional reporting on sexual assault went, I think it was from 9 to 47 in 1 year. And there was a big discussion about what's this going to do to our admissions. And so we were having this long discussion about how to spin that appropriately. And I know that sounds weird, but I was like, yeah, we built a better mousetrap. We built a mousetrap where we're actually addressing these issues seriously. And guess what happens? Reporting goes up. Like once people have faith in the system, they report it more. And guess what? And so Palms, guess what? It's going to happen again. Like this is the tip of the iceberg. You can't have 38,000 people in one place and have 7. Like that doesn't make sense. We just know that from human nature. Like I wish it was 0. That'd be awesome, but that would be a huge red flag. If you had a school this size and you had 1, that would be a problem. So this is the stuff that Clery helps us address. Like it really does bring that to bear so we can have those more difficult conversations.
And that is one place where even the press has come to, maybe not the student press, but in general the press has come to recognize that seeing spikes in reporting, particularly around sexual assault, are not an indication typically that there's something terrible that's happened. Instead, that the institution is taking steps and people feel more comfortable reporting what's happened. There are other areas certainly where if the numbers go up, you'd be like, well, what exactly is driving the fact that motor vehicle thefts have doubled from last year? There, it's a place to ask a question. In the area of sexual assault, much less so, because typically increases are a function of better reporting, better environment, not any change in the underlying incidence of sexual assault on campus.
So to just make sure I say this as plainly as possible so that you can go out and spread the word even more, in responsible employee training who aren't CSAs, I know that Bobby and Amy and the Title IX shop is very clear to say your responsibility is not to investigate. You tell the people, hey, I've got to tell at least this other office everything you tell me, and here's our brochure, and I'm kind of done with everything I have to do at this point. As a CSA, it just adds one more layer, and oh, by the way, I also have to report this as a statistic to at least one more person. And just being clear that I don't have to give your name to someone else, but I do have to, you're the third person that's told me some crime has happened to them. I do have to give this statistical information to someone else so that it ends up in this report, but your name's not going to be in that report. So I think you have that added burden of, hey, you told me you were just going to tell one other person, and now I learned you had to tell somebody else, and are you lying to me, and what's going on? You don't want to have that uncomfortable conversation. So that transparency is really important, and I'll say from the mindset of a victim of trauma, they really do appreciate your honesty and your candor about this is what I can do, this is what I can't do, this is what I have to do. And I think residence life staff, faculty, and coaches have the advantage of a pulpit at the beginning of a semester, the beginning of a class, to say, let me just tell you what I'm going to do. If you come and tell me certain things, this is what happens with that information. You can get all that out in the open up front so that when you're telling them later when they come to you, it's a repeat. As administrators, when you get cold called, you don't have that luxury. Like you have to cut them almost midstream to be like, time out, before you say anything else, know this. And so that's where I think academic advisors, regular administrators who don't have that moment of floor meetings and hall meetings at the beginning of the year or going over my syllabus, things like that. Yeah.
I serve in multiple roles on campus. So I'm an administrator, I'm an instructor in a college for graduate students, and I'm an OU advocate. And so I wonder if you can speak to the experiences of those of us who play multiple roles across campus.
Sure. So the question for the HSC in Italy is, if you serve in multiple roles, you're an advocate, you're an instructor, and you're an administrator. John, you want to speak to Clery first? Please.
Well, and it's interesting because in some of those roles you would be a CSA, and in some of them you clearly would not. The interesting piece that the Department of Education has said, because they've had some folks who've come in and said, well, I have times of my day or times of my week where I am clearly a CSA, and I have times of the day and parts of the work that I do where I clearly am not a CSA. And when they have then in turn said to the Department of Education, and it's impossible to clearly distinguish between the two. The Department of Education's response has been, okay, then you're always a CSA. And then suddenly, people are like, okay, I can distinguish much more clearly from when I am the administrator who is managing the counseling center. I'm actually much better at distinguishing between that and when I am providing counseling services to clients and when I am providing direct supervision to other licensed counselors, which is also a protected activity. So the Clery response would be, it's okay if at times you wear a hat and at times you don't, but it's a matter of keeping those straight. And if you can't keep them straight, the Department of Ed would say then you're always a CSA.
And that same confusion that comes up under responsible employee, under Title IX and civil rights is exactly what your role is. And it's when that same counselor or the advocate you're teaching class, that student happens to know that you also serve in this other capacity. So they come up to you after class and say, hey, let me do this. Let me go ahead and say that if you take from psychology and medical professionals and social work and licensing fields, you're never supposed to serve in the capacity like that with someone over whom you have power or control. So that answers that question as well. Like, I can't be your advocate because you're in my class. So I would say for someone like you, just like I give the advice to counselors who teach Psych 101 and things like that, clarify that up front. If you come to me with a problem, I'm going to have to share that because I can't be your counselor. But here's where you can go talk to somebody over in another office who's not your instructor, and we can make that a much clearer distinction. And I think that's really important to do. Yeah, so The other thing is, remember that when you're designated, whenever the government says these are all the people that are CSAs, or these are all the people that are mandatory reporters under Title IX, the institution can always expand that. And we can't contract it, but we can always expand it by what we think is more appropriate for us institutionally. This is the big argument in the Title IX world about faculty as responsible employees. And so you're seeing some of that pendulum swing right now with the proposed regulations from the Office of Civil Rights, where they're very much sort of saying maybe they shouldn't be, but then you still have most institutions, certainly most institutions in the TICSA and that our clients are saying, yeah, that's nice, we appreciate that, we still think they are. Because we're falling back to that sort of moral, ethical responsibility, the idea of safety to our campus, things like that.
And the same is true with CSAs, because one of the definitions of what makes someone a CSA is anyone the institution has said is a CSA to whom, to put it slightly differently, anyone to whom the institution has said crime should be reported. So there are lots of people who are automatically CSAs, but the institution can, through its actions, make other people CSAs as well.
All right, we've got about 5 minutes. Any other thoughts?
Lisa had the thing she wanted to show them.
Oh, I'm sorry, please.
No, but I want to make sure all their questions are answered before we talk about where they can find
Okay.
the CSA online reporting form, in case someone doesn't. And if they all know, then we're good. And this is for OU Norman, not OU HSC, right now.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, so I apologize, I'm not going to stand up so I can use my computer here. If you go to the ou.edu/emergency preparedness, and again, I'm talking OU Norman only, not OU HSC. If there's HSC people, you have questions about how to report, please talk to Rachel. She can help you with that. And I know this isn't very clear up there, but right here it says the Clery Act. You can click on that, and then it talks about, it gives you information about Jean Clery. It also is a place where you can get a copy of our Sooner Safety and Fire Report. But right here is where you can find the reporting form. So you can click on that form, and then you just walk through the process of filling out the form. And you can put in, again, as much information as you feel comfortable sharing on the CSA report. Then once you hit submit, this report goes directly to OUPD. They are the office at OU that has been designated to receive this information. And you should also get, and I think we changed this, that you would also be able to get a response back that says that you went through, so that you'll know that this went through. You do get that? Okay. So this is the form that you would fill out if, in your capacity as a CSA, someone has come to you, reported something that needs to be reported. And again, even if you have reported it to Title IX, as a CSA, you still have to take that other step as a CSA and report it to OUPD. Now, one of the things that I talked with Scott and John about, and I haven't talked to Amy, and I think it's a really good, and I don't even know if we have this on there or if you have it on your form, was to put a check mark on there about this has been reported to Title IX. If we put that on there, even though you guys are doing this as a CSA, you can check that box, this has been reported to Title IX, and we'll know not to double count that crime. But we've still taken that step for the CSA to report that to OUPD like they are supposed to do, because that's who you report crimes to. And these are allegations of crimes. These aren't crimes. This is just, and again, I'm sorry I had to step out of the room, but I'm sure that they covered with you that you do not investigate. It is not your job to determine if a crime occurred, if this person is lying or telling the truth. You are just supposed to report it, let OUPD take it from there. And then again, if OUPD is calling you back wanting more information or whatever, at that point in time, it's very good to get Bobby's office or Title IX involved and let them run interference on that before you just start giving them a lot of information, and then they're out interviewing people, and like I said, before you know it, you have a student who was reporting anonymously, and now that information's out and they didn't even want it investigated. Even if they don't want it investigated, we still have to report it because it's an allegation. Does that make sense to everyone where you can find this? So, any questions on that?
Can I ask a question? Are we concerned at all, and you might be able to weigh in on this, about the security of this form?
No, it does say that, not secure. I have had OU's IT security look at that. And the reason it does that, and I've been told this also from our web people, is that I opened it in Chrome.
No, I didn't mean that specifically. That's a good
Because it
question.
says not secure sometimes up there, and I'm like, no, it's secure.
Damn it,
No, but
Google.
Is it truly secure? Because any.
It is truly secured, it is encrypted.
Right, but I was more meaning any student could get on here and write any, like, it's not, there's no OU login for this.
No, there's not, and there's a reason for that.
And is that something that, should that be?
Yeah, when we first started with behavior, and actually this goes back to behavior intervention team reports, a number of people, when BIT was first starting out, did what we call closed system reporting. So you had to have a login to do it. And the theory was that if we open this up to the world, people are going to just flood us with these anonymous lies and like just crazy reports. It just didn't happen. Like there's no data to support it. You know, you do get the occasional malicious filing of something, like you should know that Bobby's crazy. Like, and then, like, to be fair, I mean, it's a legitimate concern. And so,
I know why he's leaving next
yeah. So, but we would just look into it, right? It's not a punitive measure, just like an allegation of some sort of harassment. We're just going to look into it. Doesn't mean anything is going to come from it. So it just hasn't borne out that way. But we do know that if we close the system, we lose the ability to get information from outside the system that might have really valuable stuff for us as our students tell their friends that don't go to school here, their parents.
Right, and that's BIT, and I know that
Yeah.
it's going to prevent, but this is a form that only CSA.
No, it's the same with Title IX. Any incident report. All the incident reports are open system.
Okay.
Anybody can file anything.
Okay.
We'd rather have too much than too little. Yeah.
And we'd definitely rather have multiple reports than under-reporting. We do go back and we do look at these and we do compare. So we try not to double count, but the Department of Education does not look very highly on institutions that under-report. I don't think you've ever been fined for over-reporting, but I do know you've been fined for under-reporting. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, they certainly will fine institutions for underreporting. Where there had been institutions that had been faulted for overreporting, it is primarily because there had been systematic or systemic issues with their Clery Act compliance, not they failed to catch that these two reports that came in from two different independent sources represented the same case.
And also one other thing I haven't mentioned, and if there are some sign-in sheets. So if you guys have not signed in, please make sure that you sign that in. Print your name and then sign. We can't give you credit for this if I can't read your name. And then there were some, I don't know if any of you were interested in the University of Montana. I don't know if you guys talked to them about this, but there were some of these letters laying around that was talking about the recent fine that they received back in September, $966,000. A lot of that had to do with their failure of their CSAs, training their CSAs, telling their CSAs that they were CSAs, and all that. So this is very, if any of you want any of these are laying around.
I'd say it's slightly different. It wasn't that their CSAs failed. It was that the university failed their CSAs.
Okay, yes, you are
Because
correct.
the university failed to identify them, failed to tell them, failed to train them.
Right, you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't know you're a CSA, then you don't know and the university failed to do that. So he is correct, right?
Yeah, so obviously if you have questions about your reporting responsibilities for OU under Title IX, you can contact Bobby. For CSA responsibilities, contact Lisa. As I mentioned in the beginning, we at TNG do work for OU, so if there's other questions that come up in your work that involve risk or risk management, you can always reach out to me. I'm happy to answer or do whatever we can to assist. I'm here, it feels like pretty regularly. I love coming to Norman, so if there's anything I can ever do to help, feel free to reach out. I'm at scott.lewis@ncrim.org. This is something I learned about 6 years ago, terrifyingly, if you know how Google searches work. If you Google my name, W. Scott Lewis, I'm actually the first thing that pops up, which, again, if you know how that works, is scary. But my email address is right there. You can reach out to me, and I'm happy to help in whatever way I can. John is here, obviously, because we're talking a lot about Clery. And when Lisa first reached out, she's like, I want you to come onto campus and talk to us about Clery. And I was like, well, I'm going to bring John, because this is what we do at the Income Group. We collect people who know I know a lot about Clery. John knows immeasurably more than I do. And that's what we do. We try to collect people who know a lot about certain areas, and we work together in this capacity. So if I can't answer your question, I'm going to find the person that absolutely can and supplant my answer with theirs. So anything we can do to help, always, always, always reach out. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Any other questions, or are we ready to go? We're ready to be done. Okay, all right.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.